I'm going to summarise my findings very quickly at the start, for those who are, and this is part of my underlying argument, just not interested in deep gaming maths. Cashback is the worst choice for every role, being less effective for the vast majority of the game, if not the entire game, depending on the length, providing little value in the late game, where it's theoretically meant to be the strongest, providing no value past 6 items, and being entirely unable to justify its own existence as an economic rune choice. Boots provides an earlier spike, more enduring and applicable value, and a more interesting design fantasy. It also has fun and engaging interactions and builds on a core game feature. And it does still provide value after 6 items. There is a reason that Magical Boots has been in the game for many years, while Cashback is a rushed, single-season change. It will take you exactly 7,000 legendary item gold, not including boots, for Cashback to have equal value to Magical Footwear. This means just to be equal, you'll need at least 2, but usually 3 full items in your build. And to outperform by a few minions worth of gold, you'll need around 4 legendary items. This is the crux of the entire argument, and the most effective single paragraph summary I can give of the issue. If you simply want to get the meta hack on which to pick, it's never Cashback, on any champion in any game. Feel free to stop watching. Now, Cashback could be changed in numbers to have earlier breakpoints in order to actually compete. However, my own view is that it's just a poorly designed rune, and that buffs wouldn't fix the issue. They would only change the direction the issue is skewed in. If you had to give it a buff, raising the percentage to 8% for the reward would make 5,500 gold, the new breakpoint, to be better than Magical Footwear. By 1 minion, but better all the same. This would make even 3 enchanter items hit the threshold, and would curve the benefits more smoothly to the mid-game. This would be the most obvious flat numbers buff you could give it in my view, as it keeps the general concept of requiring at least 2 full items. However, it comes clearly online at 3 items. I'd be very happy to see this change made for the benefit of short-term balance. Another small buff that's quality of life you could provide is including boots as a legendary item. It would feel logical and wouldn't add a huge amount of power, so it wouldn't transform the game dramatically, but would feel good all the same. These are both reasonable buffs I've thought about, but I don't think that the issue is a numbers issue, so neither of them would actually address the roots of my critique. I would much rather that instead of forcing players to do complicated maths, as I have, where they compare game lengths, item costs, relative strength to the other runes, I would much rather we just got a new rune so that players didn't have to do those things. It's not fun and it's not obvious. I think good choices in the rune trees are shown by Scorch versus Gathering Storm, where the breakpoints and the feeling of how it plays are very obvious to assess and visualise, and where both runes are useful to varying levels at all game stages, making the wrong choice perhaps punishing, but it would never leave you with a dead slot. Or Sudden Impact versus Cheap Shot, where the correct choice is obviously based on your specific champion, and in the case where a champion, for example Elise, might apply both runes, there's fun to be had in figuring out the right choice through experiences. These runes show their strength by having existed without any real criticism for the entire duration of the Runes Reforged system, and in that time they have sparked consistent, interesting discussion during co-streams, YouTube videos, and pro play. For example, X-Player should have known they'd scale this game. They're playing Azir, Gathering Storm is obviously better. Or, alternatively, X-Player valued surviving the early game and having that little bit of poke in lane, so they took Scorch on Azir, even though they know it falls off. You couldn't have a discussion like this with Cashback, because by spending time in the practice tool, it would become metrically provable that the player was either right or wrong. There is not the same nuance. Cashback will always either be better or worse than boots, because they have gold values. And those gold values are observable, they're tangible, and they're provable. Free gold, as a concept, also creates an inequality issue, where pro teams who have paid experts can allocate the time to someone doing what I've done. They can send someone off to do practice tool runs and discover the correct choices, while individual players, who generally just take the recommended runes, will not invest the same resources. into making boring, slow judgments, when instead they could just queue up and have fun. Furthermore, the rune actually works, contrary to expectations, worse on roles with low gold income. Cashback as a support is atrocious, so it's not even a free gold rune, at least not in the way that that would perhaps suggest. So it catches out the unengaged players even more. It's a bit of a noob trap in that sense, and that's a problem. It's a balance issue, because the pro teams who will pay a statistics expert to calculate the maths and realise, oh, cashback isn't very good, I should just take free boots. They'll pay someone who will do the maths and know that, and just always recommend that to the players. Whereas those players who haven't done this maths might take a look at cashback on its surface value and say, I'm playing support, supports don't make very much gold, having cashback might allow me to make more gold. Which is wrong. It is really bad to take cashback on support, as I'll explain later. Now, I'm not going to defend Futures Market, which was the predecessor of cashback, because while I personally used that rune on many occasions, I think it had worse design flaws. Futures had this same math test factor, where for a player to realise the use cases, they had to do calculations, which are deeper than most people are willing to do. But Futures Market was worse because it had a debt portion of the rune, which was emotionally punishing and unfun. The last thing anyone wants in their video game is to be reminded that debt exists. Futures also fell off at 6 items, where it would do absolutely nothing after 6 items. Front-loading of gold in League of Legends is usually better, so in power level, the previous rune was stronger than cashback, but that doesn't mean it was fun to play, commonly taken, or even understood by the community. Again, I think the solution here is just to create a new rune, with better depth and more obvious use cases and breakpoints. I don't feel this is the most pressing balance issue. Cashback could just remain unpopular, and it wouldn't really break the game. However, I think at some point this should really be resolved. Now, here are my actual conclusions about both runes in a more material and detailed sense. I'm going to start with support, as the results here are the most categoric. On support champions, it is pretty clearly not correct in any situation to take cashback. The breakpoint for it to be more efficient than boots is around the 5th full item, due to the cheaper costs of support items. This is also a point that supports aren't reaching very often at all, and cashback, unlike its two counterparts, does not amplify your utility or playmaking potential, the two core pillars of the role. The only downside to magical boots is being locked out of buying boots to roam super early, something supports often do, but those supports who commonly roam may choose to take flash traption in this branch, or a different secondary tree entirely, so this factor works against boots, but not in favour of cashback. We can vaguely compare cashback to flash traption, and say that if a support is to get at least one kill, or save their own life once by using flash traption, that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to, then they will have achieved more value than cashback in most games, as a kill is generally worth 300 gold, which, at half of your build, is more than cashback. Flash traption is more likely to impact kill scores in individual games of solo queue than in competitive play. However, the value assessment of mobility in competitive is completely different to begin with. So, even though the value add of flash traption is harder to directly quantify, it is likely going to do more for you than cashback, while also feeling cooler to use. Everyone loves flash traption, let's be real. To summarise, enchanters would rather have boots, tanks would rather have either of the other options, as there is no situation where reasonably predicting game length you could argue cashback is the best in slot. So, take one of the other two runes and leave cashback on the table. I've run some numbers on support champions. As an example of an enchanter build, Janna, at half of her build, based on the UGG most popular build for this patch, this build being Helia, Swiftness Boots, Moonstone, and her support item, at half her build, she would be getting 264 gold from cashback. If this Janna, following the same recommended build, completes her build, she will be getting 552 gold. Completing her build would be adding Redemption and Dawncore. 552 gold for her whole build. For a tank support example, I've chosen Leona, again using the recommended build from u.gg. This build is Locket, Knight's Vow, Steel Caps, and the support item. That's half of her build and would give 270 cashback gold. A Leona at full build, with Frozen Hearts and Zeke's added on top of the above, would be 552 gold, the same as Janna, coincidentally. Magical Footwear has 420 gold in value. It has 300 value because it replaces the normal boots, and it has 120 gold extra because it gives 10 movement speed. So you can begin to see how late in the build it would take you to outperform Magical Footwear. These numbers will have some variance because tank supports might build more expensive full tank items like Cainic Recurn or Warmog's Armour on some occasions, but generally this does feel pretty accurate to in-game builds. For the top lane, I'm going to focus on the early game, as I think most top laners really value their 1v1 prowess, and early leads in top lane have some of the most impact on tower taking and void objectives. Magical Boots will allow you to buy an extra cloth armour, a dagger and a potion, or to be 2 melee minions away from longsword. All decent extra strength to have on a recall if you're a bruiser or a juggernaut. While cashback, after completing your first item, which happens at around the same point in the game, would only allow you to buy a refillable potion, and you're unlikely to complete your first item before 10 minutes, so it's got the potential to be even slower than boots if you get early kills. In a lane where snowballing, 1v1 priority, and split pushing really matter, this is a pretty big early game edge for Magical Boots, wouldn't you say? I haven't done one item comparisons for every lane, but the rough totals and concept are almost always the same, with boots allowing you to buy an extra component, while cashback will only ever allow you to buy control wards or potions. If the argument you're making for taking cashback is to snowball, then the argument has weak foundations, as you clearly get better recall additions with magical boots, and it happens sooner, depending on whether or not you get kills and reduce the online time of magical boots. So it's purely a misconception that cashback is the best acceleration rune. It's just not true. For AP tops, you might be able to buy an amp tome if you take magical boots and kill a couple of minions, or you could buy a glowing mote. But again, cashback is just consumables. Tanks might look at getting a ruby crystal if they take magical footwear and kill a couple of minions, or they could buy the cloth armor we mentioned earlier, but cashback again pales in comparison. The overall gold earned with cashback also varies dramatically in the top lane, as there are many champions with many builds, and many build alterations depending on the game. This gives it an awkward strength range, where the highest gold save it could make for you, and the lowest gold save it could make for you, could be as much as 100 gold apart at full build. Unpredictability is a design weakness for runes, as you'd like to take similar runes every game, and you want to know ahead of time what to expect from them. An Aatrox at a singular item with the u.gg build for this current patch would build Eclipse and Steel Caps, at which point cashback would give him 174 gold. Again, we've calculated that roughly you get your first item around 10 minutes if you're farming really well. This is also around when you get Magical Boots, but Magical Boots is giving you 420 gold. Gwen, on one item, following the current patch u.gg build, would build Nashers and Sork Boots, and would get 180 gold. Again, much less than you would get by taking Magical Boots. Ornn, on one item, u.gg build current patch, would build Sunfire and Steel Caps, and get 162 gold. Again, much less than Magical Footwear. I've given these examples of a bruiser, an AP top, and a tank top, and for all of these champions, it is still clearly better in the early game to have Magical Footwear. I'll include on screen how those builds would scale with gold, as I don't see a point of reading them out. Junglers, out of all champions in the game, have some of the most interesting areas to consider with this rune choice, as they rely heavily on buying early mobility for ganks, making magical boots weaker on them due to the lockout, and they get some of the lowest gold income in the game, due to balancing farm and team play, so they'd theoretically be thankful for any boost to their income. Yet, this low gold income means they're unlikely to finish more than a few legendary items in a live game, and it makes them more reliant on early objective contests like scuttle crabs and invades, both areas which weigh in favour of having the faster spike and the front-loaded gold value of magical boots. Cashback here, like many other roles, sounds theoretically appealing in some ways, but when you analyse the options, again, ends up feeling lacklustre in practice. As a jungler, you would much rather have your strength kick in at the first big dragon fight instead of when you're already preparing for Soul Point. Having free boots and an extra cloth armour is going to be much more important in the early game, where small item leads can sway those skirmishers, than in full-blown teamfights where ability use, vision setup, and coordination are the concepts creating the outcome instead. This is an unspoken factor so far, but 300 gold isn't actually the same 300 gold at every stage of the game. We've been using gold to compare as it's the easiest measure to track, but it doesn't tell the full story. If anyone's confused as to how I reached 300 gold, by getting Magical Footwear boots instead of buying boots, you get 300 gold that you can immediately spend, and you get the value of having the magical boots, which isn't included in the gold number. So 300 gold in the early game has a larger impact in the late game, and I'll explain, because there's a few contributing factors. Gold is easier to earn in the later game, as minion values increase over time. Resistances aren't as valuable later in the game, as champions build percentage penetration instead of lethality or flat magic penetration. Small damage margins have lower impact on higher health bars, and while layered CC chains can shut down any champions who are caught out, regardless of their base stats or regardless of their gold lead. The longsword you got from free boots and 2 minions at 13 minutes will deal more damage than a longsword at 25 minutes. The cloth armour you had at 14 minutes, which completely negated an enemy serrated dirk, will no longer have meaning in the face of a Lord Dominic's regards at 30 minutes. Fights at 25 minutes include more participants, meaning if you blow up the enemy Ashe, that might not be enough to secure the Drake anymore, or resisting only one damage type won't be enough if you're taking mixed damage from 3 people. Front-loaded gold has always in League history been more important. It's the reason you can't buy elixirs at level 1, why lethality replaced flat armour penetration, and why beating a mid laner with a fully stacked Medjais feels impossible sometimes. Tempo has become an overused buzzword, but that doesn't make it meaningless, and the strength of magical boots on jungle champions is the perfect example of a situation where it genuinely applies. Magical boots is a really big tempo advantage. Jungle has a really wide range of champions, so providing examples is hard. I've chosen 3 from main categories just to be safe, but it doesn't cover the full range of jungle champions. For an AD jungler, we have Lee Sin, who at half of his build, Eclipse, Boots, and Sundered, would have 360 gold. I'm uncertain what boots are used in this example, but I think it's probably steel caps. Elise, at half of her build, with Sork Boots, Storm Surge, and Medjais, would have 264 gold from cashback. And Skarner, at half of his build, with Heartsteel, Serax, and Merc Treads, would have 372 gold. Again, I'll put the full numbers for their builds on screen, and I took the build recommendations from u.gg for the current patch. Many mid-lane champions are scaling champions, with weaker early game stages. This is especially true of control mages, or stacking champions like Victor, Veigar, and Smolder. Mid-laners are also a group who usually have items costing around 3,000 gold, which means that they value having a high income. Mid-lane champions rarely buy cheaper items, unlike other classes who have mixed cost builds. On an ADC, you will have some BF sword items and some Zeal items. On a tank jungler, you will have some full tank items and some support tank items. Mid-laners don't really have this same variance. That makes this a good point to take cashback at its one merit, that if a game does go long enough, eventually it will have given you more raw gold than magical boots. However, even this angle of consideration has downsides. In every example, I've listed the potential gold save at maximum build, which does look very satisfying, to be honest. But after 6 items, there's no more items to buy, so gold has limited opportunities to be spent. Once you hit this point in the game, all that the rune is doing anymore is allowing you to buy your first elixir slightly earlier, which only in rare situations will even matter, and, as far as I'm concerned, is hardly a justification for taking a rune in Champion Select. This is important, as it means that the refund from the last legendary item you purchase is having the least value out of all of the refunds, as it isn't speeding up any more permanent power, simply it's giving you a temporary spike. It's also worth noting that in the late game, fights are much less frequent, especially in higher levels of play, so you might go the entire duration of your first elixir without using it in serious combat, more than a 1v1 or a pick, if the point where you buy that first elixir is when Baron or Dragon are on cooldown. After your first elixir, there will be zero effect from cashback at all anymore. Having 1,000 free gold sounds immensely badass, until you realise that it's given to you in trickles and that you're left holding 1,000 gold with nothing left to buy in your 50-minute slugfest. At this point, you'd much rather have the permanent movement speed buff of Magical Footwear, or a better scaling rune like Gathering Storm or even Overgrowth. If you sell your boots for a bonus item, then neither of the runes is assisting you anymore, so technically there is a super late game break even, in the same way that there is a super early game truce before either rune has activated yet. An Ahri with half of her build on the current patch would be building Malignance, Horizon Focus, and Sork boots. Cashback would provide 324 gold at that point. If the Ahri completes her build by adding Zonya's Hourglass, Void Staff, and Death Cap, she would have 915 gold returned to her by cashback. A Yasuo, at half of his build, would be building Blade of the Ruined King, Immortal Shield Bow, and Berserker's Greaves. He would be getting 372 gold from cashback, and at his complete build he would have Infinity Edge, Stridebreaker, and Mortal Reminder, giving him 978 gold from cashback. Based on my general tests throughout this, I think that 900 gold is relatively typical if you don't build any supportive items, and 1,000 gold is the most that any real build that includes boots will save with cashback. I haven't tested enough champions or situations for a concrete answer, but my assumption is that around 850 gold is the standard for most champions building at least one utility item. The samples listed here are mostly solo queue damage builds, but based on those, cashback could be potentially double or more Magical Footwear in raw gold for most builds, if you make it all the way to 6 items, which, as we know, is a luxury that rarely happens. I miss the days of longer games. The breakpoints for ADCs with expensive builds are some of the earliest of any champion class, yet, even for ADCs, you'll need to be at your 4th item to have more value than magical boots in raw gold. It becomes hard to see any argument for why you would ever want to wait this long into a game for your rune to be useful, when even high elo ADCs are not usually getting to their 4th item in every game, or they aren't getting to it until the game is nearly done, at which point the outcomes are usually already pretty clear and won't be that impacted by 100 gold or 1 cannon minion that you've saved with cashback. Draven is the perfect example. He buys literally the most expensive item options, yet he doesn't outclass magical boots in value until his 3rd legendary and 4th overall item, including boots. He matches Magical Footwear in value at the halfway point of his build, but waiting 3 items for value you could have had at 1 item is simply silly and is out of line with his lane bully playstyle. If anything, Draven would rather you'd just taken an aggressive rune tree instead in most matchups. ADCs have the added vector that they rely on movement speed for kiting, making magical boots slightly more effective on them in both a practical sense and a gold sense. Furthermore, ADCs are weak in the early game and do not commonly roam before 12 minutes, meaning they can afford to wait for magical boots to come online, and that having the front-loaded gold from magical boots may make them better able to curve their power spikes, another point in its favour. The Zeal item percentage movement speed buffs aren't enough to have a major impact with the movement speed from the Magical Footwear rune. I tested Jinx without her passive running a Phantom Dancer and Berserker's Greaves, and found that the cashback variant had plus 75 ms and the Magical Boots variant had plus 85 ms. This means that the plus 10 ms from Magical Footwear wasn't multiplied by enough to add even one bonus point, and that only the flat bonus applied. This is mathematically consistent because 8% of 10 is less than 1. Multipliers involving the 10 bonus ms aren't going to be majorly changed by this bonus, and so they shouldn't be considered in assessments of the rune's power numerically. This was unexpected. Intuitively, I thought the numbers would be higher, and this is actually an area where I had been overrating Magical Boots. However, I don't feel this matters very much and was always just a neat bonus point. A Caitlyn at half of her build, using the UGG recommended build path on the current patch, would be building Collector, Berserker's Greaves, and Infinity Edge, and cashback would give her 396 gold. At full build, the same Caitlyn, with Bloodthirster, Lord Dominic's Regards, and Rapid Fire Cannon, would get 939 gold at full build. Draven, at half of his build, using the U.GG recommended build for the current patch, would have Bloodthirster, Infinity Edge, and Berserker's Greaves, and would hit the dead-on break-even of 420 gold from cashback. That same Draven, at full build, if he adds Lord Dominic's Regards, a Mortal Shield Bow, and Rapid Fire Cannon, would have 939 gold. Out of all the champions I've compared, this is how their savings look at full build. I have not compared every champion in the game, and I have only compared the builds that are suggested by U.GG. Individual champion mains and one-tricks who are interested in working out the effectiveness for their specific champion and their specific build choices should use the in-game practice tool to compare for their own champions. However, as I think I've explained at length, you're probably better just taking Magical Footwear. To conclude this video, before 12 minutes, neither rune is likely to be active. At 1 item, 2 items, and 2 items plus boots, it is very clear that Magical Footwear is the best. Depending on your champion and their build, Magical Footwear is still quite likely the best at the 3rd item. Only after 4 full items is cashback better in most cases, and the margin by which it's more effective is only quite slim. At 6 full items, Magical Footwear returns to being better because it's giving you plus 10 ms, while cashback isn't doing anything anymore. If you sell your boots and your full build at 6 items, neither rune is doing anything. This makes Magical Footwear better, in almost every practical case, for the majority of the game, regardless of whether you're planning to scale, snowball, or some combination of both. The only exception is support champions, who under no conditions whatsoever at all should ever be taking cashback. I feel that a complete replacement of this rune is the best option for changing it, for reasons outlined earlier around fun, ease of understanding, and the ability to be balanced properly at all MMRs. If a temporary stopgap buff were to be needed, I feel that increasing the reward percentage to 8% would make the scaling curve flow better, but that wouldn't resolve the absence of player comprehension or the overall boring design. Thank you for watching. Please comment any analysis I may have missed, or any topics you feel are relevant elaboration. I'd also love to hear your ideas for solutions, buffs, or changes to the rune.